Welcome to the Allo.Capital podcast. If you're just joining us, we're doing seasons. This season, we are summoning Allo.Capital, a new spin-out from Gitcoin that's designed to build capital allocation, the capital allocation layer of the next internet. In what ways will tokenization and AI affect the way we allocate capital? I think there's big upside. Capital allocation is a multi-trillion-dollar design space with VCs, governments, NGOs, and DAOs all here having to allocate capital to achieve their goals. But it's also a place where we can start small. Every time you spend money, you are allocating capital. We are threading a through line, partnering with builders, researchers, and funders to figure out what on-chain post-AI capital allocation looks like and building it on-chain on Ethereum. If you want to learn more, you can visit our website at Allo.Capital, where you can download the books for Allo books for free and play with some of our dApps, join the Telegram, or participate in the DAO. Our guests today are all returning friends of the podcast: Carl Cervone, Jonas from Optimism, and James from Octant. Carl is an open source data enthusiast. His current focus is on OSO, Open Source Observer, a data platform for crypto foundations and ecosystem funds to measure impact. Previously, Carl worked at Protocol Labs on hypercerts, and he is a Gitcoin steward. Jonas runs the retro funding program at Optimism, and James Kiernan is the head of impact at Octant. We are here today to talk about tectonic shifts in Ethereum public goods funding. The group that we've assembled today are all OGs working on Ethereum public goods funding and are doing really interesting things in the design space of Ethereum public goods funding. We are here to talk about how the public goods funding ecosystem in Ethereum is evolving over the next cycle. Where have we been? How does it inform where we're going? And what do you need to know as a builder in the public goods funding / regen / incentive alignment space in the Ethereum ecosystem? So what's the coolest stuff that's going on in the frontier? How are changes in how ecosystems are deploying treasury and verifiable impact, changes in the world, changes in AI, zero knowledge, going to affect Ethereum public goods funding? We are playing jazz on top of that design space and hopefully building a more solid public goods funding space by getting the top personalities from the top public goods funding ecosystems all together to talk about how we build this movement. So on this episode, we talk about roadmap changes in the Ethereum ecosystem, changes at the EF, stablecoin adoption, ZK, AI, new funding sources, public goods funding innovations like deep funding, deep gov, Ethereum localism, L2s, on-chain social, all of the stuff. We talk about the tectonic shifts in the Ethereum public goods funding space, and I think it's a very noteworthy episode because of that. I hope you enjoy. All right. Hey, Carl. Hey, Jonas. Hey, James. How's it going?
Hey.
Yeah, doing well.
Glad to have you. We are here to talk about tectonic shifts in Ethereum public goods funding. What are all the things that are changing as the Ethereum ecosystem is going through a renaissance and as new technologies like ZK and AI come online? And would love to start by just talking about your individual ecosystems and what's happening there. Let's do maybe 3 minutes per person, and then we'll kind of play jazz on top of that. So, James, I'd love to start with what's going on at Octant, what's Octant V2, and then we'll go to Jonas, and then we'll go to Carl. Go ahead, James.
Kevin, thanks for having me. So a little backstory on Octant is we've been running this grants platform for the past few years. The idea behind it is bringing sustainability to grants. So coming from a large treasury with Golem, we had a little over 100,000 ETH staked, and we've been using the staking rewards to essentially power our grant rounds. So a little over $8 million distributed to a few hundred projects, and we haven't touched $1 of the principal capital. So we're really encouraged by this idea of using yield and DeFi to power grant programs. And now what we're doing is building the rails so that any ecosystem can essentially emulate this model. So taking whatever value flow that you have within Web3 and then being able to efficiently hook that up into any sort of allocation process you want to use to grow your ecosystem. The big caveat with that and kind of like the carrot that we're waving in front of these different entities is giving them a powerful enough tool so that their ecosystem can grow sustainably, with the ask that we're all contributing a small piece of yield to this meta pool of funding that we're calling the Ethereum Sustainability Fund. The idea behind that is we're trying to bring sustainable funding to like the ETH base layer public goods that everyone building on top of Ethereum relies upon. So yeah, we can talk more about that, but that's the big grand goal that we're going for here.
Thanks, James. I wonder if you could, riff a little bit on the Ethereum ecosystem fund. I'm really excited to see how that develops and how the funding flows there. Anything more to say about that?
Yeah, well, I think so. We're transitioning from Octant V1, which is what you've maybe seen thus far up until this point, over into this new set of rails that we're building that we're calling Octant V2. Ideally, going to be launching in September or October of this year, and we'll have a lot more information coming out about that. And happy to chat about that a little bit further as well.
Okay, thanks. Jonas, maybe we'll go to you next and hear what's going on at Optimism and in the Superchain.
Of course. Thank you for having me, Milwaukee. At Optimism, we're like hyper focused on interop. If you haven't heard about this yet, interop is this magical solution that makes all the OP chains and the super chains, so um, chains that you know and love, like OP mainnet, World, Unichain, Base, etc. Um, chains within the super chain that commit to interop make them feel like one chain, and I think that's what we've been chatting about for ages, solving the fragmentation problem within the layer 2 space. We're very excited there to build on common standards together with the larger Ethereum community. So these are things like 7802, like the cross-chain token interface, things like this. Other than interop, which is our like number one priority, we're making great updates to Optimism governance. So you might have heard that Optimism governance is made up of the token house, which is OP token holders, and then the citizens house. And this season, we're shipping really interesting updates to the citizens house for the first time, giving like a clear rule set of who the citizens are. I think that's a very interesting moment for non-plutocratic governance in general. And then obviously kind of what I'm thinking about most of my time is retroactive public goods funding. And there we're just chugging away at the problem, dedicating a lot of resources towards open source developer tooling in the EVM space, and then builders on different OP chains. So yeah, lots of stuff going on. That's kind of the three high level things in a nutshell.
Thanks, Jonas. Carl, let's go to you next. Have you been observing open source at Open Source Observer? And what are you observing? What's changing at Open Source Observer? Say that 3 times
Uh,
fast.
Thanks, Kevin. It's great to be back on the pod, and love being here with Jonas and James, two of the partners that we've worked closely with over the past couple of years. Great Ethereum public goods funders. Yeah, as you alluded to, Open Source Observer is observing open source. Um, as an organization, our mission is to measure impact in the open, and in order to do that well, it's very difficult to get all the data you need from a single source. And so we spend a lot of our time trying to unify different sources that allow you to get a more holistic view of what impact might look like. In the Ethereum public good space, that includes things like project registries, data on who is funding who, all the on-chain things, off-chain work like developer activity, package repositories, etc. There's just a lot of things that need to be unified, and our focus is trying to make open tooling and infrastructure that allows anybody to explore the data and then build things on top of it. Over the past year or so, I would say that we've been working closely with a number of funders, Optimism being kind of the leading example, to leverage that infrastructure to fund um, both open source projects as well as builders sustainably. And I think we've kind of entered the phase right now where we are just kind of quietly making small improvements on a regular basis, both to the quality of the data and to helping funders leverage that to fund the things that they care about more. So really excited. It's been kind of a long slog to get to this point. We think now really the tooling is there to do some pretty amazing things.
This might be too reductionist, but I'm wondering, it feels like Open Source Observer, when you all enter the chat, we go from these like sort of like popularity contests or Keynesian beauty contests to more data-based ways of funding things. Would you say that the Open Source Observer is pulling in that direction? And is that too reductionist?
I think that's a good way of distilling it. The thing that we have struggled with is where are the right parts in the process to kind of get human judgment and to distill that in a way that's going to improve decision making. One thing that we've observed is that if you get things wrong, if an algorithm puts some really scammy project at the top of the list, a lot of people will tell you very quickly that they don't like that result. On the other hand, if you have a results distribution which is pretty innocuous and people think that it is funding things that make sense, then they won't say anything. So you get a lot of negative feedback when you get it wrong. You don't hear very much when things are going well. And I think there's a lot to learn in that insight.
Yeah, for sure. Um, Okay, well, I'd love to play jazz on top of our respective four ecosystems about how Ethereum public goods is changing in 2025 and beyond. And I think that the way that I can volley this back to you all is, what are the trends that you all are excited about in Ethereum or public goods funding in general? And I would love to just sort of snake through each of us and start to play jazz on top of this design space. From where I stand, it seems like there's a lot changing. It feels like treasuries are getting tighter. Feels like Ethereum itself is really working on solving fragmentation, improve UX, scale the layer one, scale the layer two is the official roadmap. I know that there's lots of people that are focused on the app layer right now. And then there's also technological developments that are happening. AI, ZK, the Stablecoin Genius Act just passed in Congress, I think this week, the day before we're recording. So just the synthesis of all of these things, it just feels like there's a big sea change happening right now. And, selfishly for Gitcoin and Gitcoin 3.0, I want to figure out how we fit in, but figuring out how we can all support each other and build this movement together is really exciting for me. So y'all just volley it out to the group. What trends are y'all excited about, and what do you hope to see? If you're a builder out there, what should you be focused on? What trends should we be thinking about?
Well, I think one thing that I was really encouraged by talking back and forth with Tomasz on Twitter a little bit, he was talking about things that Ethereum ecosystem can do to support the ETH and kind of driving the Ethereum mission forward. And one thing that we noticed at Octant a few years back was talking to a lot of grantees that there is much needed support beyond the financial. And it seems like this is becoming more and more recognized that, giving builders mentorship, giving them access to networks, giving them, the tools that they need to be able to scale is that's becoming more and more recognized. So I'm really encouraged by that. And I think that's going to start driving a lot more apps that everyone's asking where they are right now in the Ethereum ecosystem.
On the application layer, I think related to what you're talking about, James, like a big unlock here is more distribution for builders. And I think there's like multiple trends going towards that. Like mini apps on Farcaster, mini apps on World are becoming fairly popular. We see people like Coinbase or Kraken come online and kind of plug their distribution channels into the on-chain world. I think it's coming. It's coming. Definitely a bit slower than we expected if we would have looked back a few years ago. But I think at this point it's probably like a bit underappreciated that we're adding many more distribution channels and the new UX of things like mini apps coming online. Like if I had to go outside of the public goods funding space, this is what excites me the most in terms of Ethereum app layer development at the moment.
Yeah, I have a slightly contrarian take, or maybe contrarian in this group, perhaps not outside the group. I think we're like deep in the trough of sorrow right now when it comes to Ethereum public goods funding. I think that maybe the last time we were all together, we were at like the peak of inflated expectations, and it's been like a long, or not, it's been a short and pretty painful ride all the way down. I
That
think
means
right
the
now,
slope of enlightenment is coming up next, Carl. We all know
that
what
is
comes
why we are
next.
here. I think we're all here because we believe deeply that these mechanisms have a future, not just for Ethereum, but beyond Ethereum. But I think we are at the point right now where we are the believers, and the people that we are preaching to are smaller. The numbers have thinned out since where they were a year or two ago, which is also the most important time. I think this is when mechanisms hardened. This is when you kind of separate the wheat from the chaff, and the really powerful mechanisms rise out of this. But I think that right now, within Ethereum, there's been a lot of soul searching. Hopefully, right now, as James has been alluding to, things are getting better. Like a direction is emerging. I think that a few months ago, you could say there was maximum FUD around public goods funding, specifically in Ethereum, and what programs like Gitcoin and Optimism were doing. I'll say that Octant has always been kind of above the fray, at least, or it seemed that way to me. But I think that, we are definitely not out of the woods right now. And I think this is really going to be a pivotal time to figure out if we're actually going to create useful things that can go beyond just crypto funding crypto.
Yeah, the Trough of Sorrow take resonates with me, not just because I'm a content producer and I love the take that's spicy, but we just reset Gitcoin as I think most people on this podcast know, but for the listeners' benefit, Gitcoin 3.0 coming soon, TM. There's two people working at Gitcoin right now, and we're just completely resetting the entire thing. And a lot of hard lessons have come out of the last 4 years for us, especially about sustainability and market viability of these tools. And I feel like the dream is still a beautiful dream, but we're at this inflection point where the novelty and the excitement of the 2021 era bull, the optimism has worn off, and even the fumes of it, I don't think are even here anymore. And now it's time to get real about what this technology can really do. And there are some things that I'm very excited about that I'm seeing it really work very well. But the pond has definitely gotten smaller over the last couple years, and so, I know that I've seen a lot of contributors that told me, "Hey, I'm no longer in this space anymore full time because I needed to go get a job or I needed to go support myself and support my family." But I still believe in the mission and I still believe in the ethos. So I feel like there's still that beating heart, like that ember of belief that Ethereum can fund its own public goods and can fund the world's public goods one day. But maybe it's time to get real about what that actually should look like. And maybe that's my next prompt for the group is, what should that look like? I mean, what trends are we really excited about and want to double down on? And let's call it the 2026 through the 2028 cycle. I mean, I think we maybe think the super cycle is dead over here, but next cycle, what are we keeping an eye on and where are we doubling down?
The super cycle will never end. It's
As
always
long as
it's
it lives
always
in our
right
hearts.
about exactly. It lives on in our hearts. Um, I'm particularly excited about like algorithmic token allocation. We're doing it at Optimism. I would say things like deep funding are in a similar boat, and there's a lot of like new, fresh experimentation in that field. While we are in this kind of valley at the moment of sadness, here I feel like we've actually made a lot of progress in evolving these mechanisms and making them more robust. And the current situation gets us to ask the right questions. Just because these mechanisms are not as shiny and exciting anymore, there is not as much like public appreciation for funding Ethereum public goods. It leads us to ask the right questions, which is how effective are we allocating capital? What are the outcomes that we're creating with this? Um, and so overall, I'm excited to see more algorithmic decision making in the space, and then also a much more thoughtful approach to how we measure the effectiveness of these mechanisms.
I think the algorithmic approach to me is interesting because there's governance fatigue from having to vote too much. So you sort of dampen that. It's a response to that, but it also makes the allocation arguably more effective and more scalable to do algorithmic uh, amplification. But I'm reminded a little bit of Vitalik's piece here, where he says that AI should be the engine and humans should be the steering wheel. So at the end of the day, you're still distilling human judgment. I think the word that Vitalik literally uses is distilled human judgment with these algorithmic policies. I don't know if you have a response to that, Jonas, but that's just what it brings up for me.
Yeah, this is my biggest contrarian take on the deep funding experiment. There's like tons of parts that I love about it, and after many months of looking into it, I'm still trying to wrap my head around some of them. One part that I'm not fully aligned on is that you only want to purely scale human judgment. Human judgment breaks down in a lot of forms that we've observed, especially in the retro funding experiment over the years. It's things like quantification. We know inherently humans are not great at quantifying stuff. It's things like using local judgment for like global decision making that easily result in bias. So there's a lot of flaws with only relying on human judgment. And so I'm not super bullish on only scaling human judgment because we're just scaling a lot of noise in that way. I think we need some mixture here of humans steering the mechanism in the right direction, but actually using data-driven decision making to make really objective choices and reduce kind of the noise that we have in these models.
Yeah. And then I'll just note here that Optimism, I think, is a pioneer in data-driven decision making. This is maybe 9, 12 months ago, but when y'all did impact metrics-based retro funding, that blew a lot of minds. I remember, and Carl, I know that you had a big hand in this project as well. But to go from voting from 600 different projects to just voting on a couple of different data points, and then the system distributes those data points into votes, that blew some minds when I told people about it, and I still point to it as something that I think is an innovation that would only be possible in these kind of spaces. So yeah, kudos to you for innovating there.
Appreciate that. I think that what we're doing now is very much an extension of that. I think that one of the key lessons learned from voting on metrics is that it's very difficult to construct a global set of metrics to apply to everyone. And now a lot of the focus is really on trying to create localized versions of that. So it could be within a chain, certain things are important and you want to emphasize those. It could be within a developer tooling ecosystem. There are certain types of things that have much more significance between which products we're using a certain set of tools. And ideally trying to scale localized decisions by bringing in data or AI to help kind of augment things is where I would just say a lot of our focus is. I would also perhaps draw some analogy to where I think things are needed in the real world. And this debate that I often have, both with you, Kevin, and like private DMs, and more generally when I talk about this to other people, is you know, right now confidence in funding public goods is at such a low level. I think you can look at governments everywhere, and trust in governance is very low. We can all say that there are certain things that we need and don't have a good funding model, but then when it comes to actually figuring out how much they're worth and who should fund them, there's a lot of debate. And we are kind of within Ethereum, kind of going back and forth. Should we actually be trying to fix these things in Ethereum, or should we be trying to solve more of these problems in the real world and look for ways that we can export these lessons or kind of onboard new sets of users to using these types of things? Um, I go back and forth on that. Like, if you were to ask me, is the single most important thing to solve Optimism's public goods funding or Octant's public goods funding, or is it actually to try and go to a completely new part of the world? It could be taking a government, or it could be taking some community and helping them set up these structures. I go back and forth on that. I'm curious if others have like an inclination of which area they think is more urgent to get some of these things to scale beyond where they currently are.
I would add to that. I think that's already happening a little bit. I mean, we are starting to see things like impact staking from the Lido ecosystem, where people are able to deposit capital into wallets and then have that yield streamed directly to somebody like UNICEF or Mercy Corp or something like that. So, I think there is this willingness by entities that maybe have historically been outside of our ecosystem start to dip their toe into the water with what we're building here, because they're seeing the utility of it. So I'm really encouraged by that.
One of the things I think is interesting here is, I mean, the episode's called Ethereum Public Goods Funding, but I feel like Ethereum's a polycentric ecosystem. Polycentric sounds like a big scary word, but for the audience, it just means many centers. Polycentric political economies are an archetype for pluralism, because if there's many centers, it means that even if one center gets captured, then the other centers can continue on doing what they're doing. And I see it's almost like there's permutations of all of the organizations, which includes L1s, L2s, DAOs, DeFi projects, things like ENS, like all the organizations, all of the mechanisms, quadratic funding, retro funding, deep funding, stuff, et cetera, et cetera. And then all of the treasuries and their goals. So, for ENS, it's probably ENS adoption. For Optimism, it's the Superchain, but also Ethereum. I don't want to speak for any specific organization. So if you almost think about like the permutations of all the mechanisms times all of the ambitions times all of the organizations, you get this polycentric pluralistic ecosystem of public goods funding that kind of goes off in all these different directions, all these different apertures of things that are being tried and mechanisms through which you're creating it. And it almost becomes like a hot ball of public goods funding, when
Right.
all the money that's flowing in all these different directions. And I just wonder about the plurality of that, and whether a solid base starts to form around funding Ethereum and like our upstream dependencies and open source software. And then once you've got that, you can kind of start shooting off in all these different directions, like climate, or, things that are not Ethereum public goods, but are funding the world's public goods with Ethereum. You reach some sort of critical mass in that polycentric, pluralistic political ecosystem. And to me, that becomes really exciting. And this is like kind of literally playing forward the modular roadmap for Ethereum into its political economy implications of how we fund public goods in the future. So I think that let me try to land this plane. I'm excited about the plurality here of all the mechanisms and all the organizations and all the different apertures of public goods funding that can be created. And I think that there's something here where the scale, the sum is worth more than each of its parts. So I don't know if you have any reaction to that, but there's a take of something I feel really, really strongly about: plurality, Polycentric. I think it gets really beautiful once this engine gets humming.
Yeah, I really like what you said there. I think what I'm kind of modeling what I'm seeing. The easiest way to describe it is it seems like we're getting more diverse in our experimentation. And then we're also getting really serious about bringing sustainability to what we know needs to be funded. And so that's just going to be this ever increasing graph that is expanding out more and more. And ultimately, when we're getting to this really efficient and sustainable way of funding what we know we need to fund, Ethereum is just going to have that competitive advantage for this foreseeable future. So, yeah, I'm really encouraged by that.
And I just want to give, I gave Jonas kudos for innovating on data-centric public goods funding in the past. So I want to give Octant a huge shout out for really focusing on sustainability. The fact that you can fund public goods with yield and treasury number not go down, I think is a beautiful thing. So you all are far and away the winner in number not go down public goods funding. And I think it's really an interesting niche, and I hope you're very successful. If we had a treasury that was large enough to use it, then I would love to play with it.
Well, I'd love to talk to you after this call. I'm sure we can devise some kind of plan there. There's an
Yeah.
opportunity.
Don't sell to me, sell to the audience. They're the ones that are passionate about this movement and maybe have a treasury bigger than me. But yeah, we should
Yeah.
we should talk. And I'm excited about collabs between Octant 2.0 and Gitcoin 3.0 and all that kind of stuff. So we should talk.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think the Octant model is really impressive here, and that it shows to something that we're largely missing in the Ethereum public goods funding space, which is kind of positive feedback loops on the capital that is being spent. Right. So if we go in all these directions and we spend all these resources on Ethereum public goods, and we want to go beyond that, what value capture or accrual will allow us to do that? And that has been a part that's been largely missing in this ecosystem. I think Octant is doing a great job of having a sustainable model there. At Optimism, we've always been big believers that if we invest in the public goods that make the Superchain, this ecosystem, great, it will result in additional growth, which will allow us to invest in it even more. That is kind of in the flywheel that we're looking at. But I think beyond that, there is still something missing here. And I know across the ecosystem, or you touched on this, budgets are getting tighter. There's a lot of concern around value capture across all kinds of layers. And it's still unclear which players in the ecosystem that are actually able to capture value from additional growth in the Ethereum ecosystem are willing to reinvest it into the open source software and other things that we need to continue growing.
I think that flywheel is super important. I you know, if an L2 sells block space, then you would want to have public goods funding that supports the creation and the sale of new block space. If a and the generalizable version of this is that if your DAO ecosystem sells widgets or sells X, then you want public goods that support the creation of X of widgets. And so starting to see more ecosystems that actually have a flywheel where public goods funding is supporting that flywheel in the most narrow sense, I think will create more sustainability for the ecosystems that do it. But then I'm also wondering if there were like a norm of, how much is just going to go upstream to our open source dependencies and to public goods for the world, and can that become a competitive advantage for you to be exporting good for the world? Like a competitive advantage in that it gives you a better brand, but also I think that there was a tendency, at least in some of the Gitcoin stuff, where like if we're doing something good upstream for the world, then it gets like jumped on from culture war people, and that becomes a brand negative as our brand becomes politicized because there was a climate round run on our protocol or something like that. And so, I mean, I guess the 2 points there are that flywheel is really important, but also what's the secondary thing where you're funding upstream public goods and other social goods in the world, and how can that be a good for the protocols that are doing it?
Yeah, maybe to connect your question back to, I think, the original purpose of this podcast, which is to talk about shifts that are happening in Ethereum public goods funding. I think there is something there in going from just having a treasury and spending it over time and giving it away, and somehow hoping that it's going to create utility and that people are going to kind of take your token or do something with it. That was maybe the old meta. I think the new meta is that there is going to be some kind of profit sharing or way of generating sustainable revenue, and that there's going to be a credible commitment to putting that back into the public goods and the builders that enable that. And obviously in the case of Octant, it is yield. Super simple mechanism. In the case of the Superchain, it's sequencer fees, also very transparent. And I think the value in this, not only for builders, but also for anybody who's kind of monitoring this ecosystem, is you can go in and see up to the minute how much revenue is going into this fund. And that gives people a very clear signal that this is a source that is replenishing and it's not just going to vanish or get yanked. I hope more ecosystems start doing that because I think that there are probably many ways that you can create value. There are many different commitments you can make to sharing that value with others in your ecosystem, and it would be a shame if Octant and Optimism are the only ones that pioneer some new design space here.
A hot take to throw onto that is that I'm bearish on like norms and norm enforcement to fund public goods. Uh, I think the proposals about it are great, but in the current climate, it's just like there's less and less kind of positive virtual signaling, and the importance of it is going down a lot. Right, everybody's kind of looking for the next growth stage to keep on surviving here. So it becomes harder and harder to convince organizations to make these commitments purely based on norms and maybe brand equity that they get. I agree though, it's probably like the best thing that we can do outside of having like sustainable value capture and reinvestment mechanisms is norms. But overall, I think in the current environment, it's becoming harder and harder to convince organizations to take these steps purely on like a kind of a alignment signaling basis.
I would echo that. I see a lot of ecosystems, just looking at the cost of doing this, and they're not, very quickly seeing the results, and so they're having a hard time justifying it from a business standpoint. So, yeah, one of the things that kind of took me by surprise as I've been talking to a lot of different ecosystems, especially L2s, is how much they're paying in infrastructure. And when you're talking about funding, network goods that maybe sit at mainnet and aren't directly, um, you know, having some kind of impact on them on a day-to-day basis, even though, but we can very easily see how they would over time. They just start to look at this as charity rather than, something that is essentially needing to be funded. And so, um, yeah, I agree with you. It's definitely a very challenging problem to solve when a lot of different L2s are seeing this massive amount of business costs, and then you're asking to have them fund additional things on top of that. It's a paradigm shift that things are gonna be pretty hard to move.
I think it's interesting to think about public goods funding. I think a lot of times it gets maligned as it's just charity. And I think that that's like one Overton window or sort of like comparable that you can think about public goods funding as. I wonder about the other Overton window. Like I feel like the 2021 era of DAOs was just like taking your organization and putting it on chain, like taking your company and putting it on chain. Um, and I wonder if public goods funding was seen as a replacement for full-time employment with like fully loaded costs and benefits. Instead, having sort of like funding flows out to a network of open source contributors as a replacement for having a centralized team, open source marketers, things like that. I think that if you make the comparable for public goods funding about building an ecosystem and apps that are building on top of your ecosystem and realizing that networks of funding are more effective at doing that than centralized hierarchies that are hiring things. I wonder if that sort of shifts the conversation from, oh, this is a cost center to like, this is actually something that we're going to save costs on in the long term. And so I'll be curious to see if that's a meta that ends up playing out in the future.
I think there are a lot of strategies here for ecosystems and L2s where quote unquote funding public goods can actually advance their goals and needs. I think a great example here is of where Optimism is spending a lot on open source dev tooling. And we have the strong belief that we want an ecosystem of open source tools rather than closed source SaaS models. And that over the long run, this will enable much more growth um, in the ecosystem. And I think that's a really strong case for why would you fund open source software and invest a lot there, and why it might make sense for your ecosystem. And I'd love to see more of these models emerge, ecosystem players that think of funding open source as a competitive advantage to their business.
I think the word they use, Jonas, around like norms. I think that there's perhaps a distinction between norms and then maybe smart defaults. I think that right now there's a norm that any new ecosystem is going to provide DeFi incentives. They're going to jumpstart, you know, liquidity programs and so on. And people, whenever a new L2 launches or, something's happening, there's lots of builders that line up for that and are kind of there, even though it isn't kind of encoded anywhere. There's going to be a certain percentage of the treasury that's going to go towards this type of thing. It's just an expectation that's built up. I feel like an underexplored area is around smart defaults. If you kind of take the analogy that these crypto networks are like nation states, you could say that there's a set of things that everybody should be funding, and maybe there's like a default amount that you can look at comms, or you can look at something else, say, okay, this amount should go towards infrastructure, this amount should go towards developer tools, this amount should go towards research, et cetera. You could itemize those things and maybe have a certain amount, which is kind of the default setting. And then obviously governance is going to adjust that, but you kind of go from a world where in many cases, people just have no idea if any of that is going to get funded or it's someone else's problem, to there being not only an expectation, but a set of comps that people can use to start planning around.
Yeah, I mean, on that point, that's exactly what we're thinking with this. This meta pool of funding is just getting everybody to contribute a small portion of yield, and then collectively deciding like what do we need to fund that, sustainably to support these builders that are providing so much value to our ecosystem as a whole. So, I mean, you hit the nail on the head there, Carl.
I like the idea of, actually, Carl, this brings me back to the Gantt charts that you and I were working on around Zoo's Allo hackathon, where it's basically show on the left the sources of the funding and then the mechanisms that they get complexified into. And then
Sankey chart. Very important.
Oh, that's right.
clarification.
Sankey chart. Excuse me. I got my charts mixed up. That's like the
I haven't
ultimate
made a
nerd
Gantt
sin.
chart in a long time.
Yeah. Wow. I feel now I've completely taken my point off course, but as I guess like the Sankey chart, I'm curious to see if we can get more funders pouring in more funding into specific mechanisms, and if there becomes like a Schelling point where multiple funders can come to the table in one place. I feel like we've seen shimmers of that, glimmers of that at Gitcoin, and if it starts to sort of happen around Octant or Gitcoin or Optimism, or maybe like a superstructure around those things, then you just get economies of scale there. And I think that that's really exciting for me. We can see the emergence of new categories of public goods funding once the infrastructure exists to attract the initial capital and then compounding capital as we grow these things. So I think that gets really cool. So hopefully we'll see that in the 2025 Sankey chart. Thank you, Carl.
Yeah, fully agree. It's something that I think about a lot. Maybe concretely speaking, we've talked about being in this soul searching phase, this valley of sadness, trough of sorrow, etc. I think one of the signs that we are out of that will be, number one, maybe it's a norm, or maybe it's just a understanding that there are certain things that everybody should be funding, and some concept that you are kind of paying your fair share by funding this thing. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be pro rata based on treasury or TVL or something like that. But the idea that two entities that might otherwise be competing are actually funding the same thing is good for Ethereum. I think is a sign that we've matured and are ready to enter this next phase.
Well, we're entering the phase.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
All of us going at once. This is so exciting. Go ahead, James.
I was going to say, like on that point, there's a business opportunity, I think, there as well, because a lot of this funding is happening off chain behind closed doors. And so if you actually start to build a graph that is transparently showing like where all these funds are both coming from and then where they're going, you might find that there's actually a lot of things that don't need as much funding as they're getting from all these fragmented sources. And at the same time, you're able to identify like where maybe funds that, different entities that should be getting more funding are at the moment being underfunded. So I think, coming together and having more transparency around like where funds are going and creating this like funding graph throughout Ethereum is going to be really supportive towards a lot of business problems that different ecosystems might be experiencing.
We have a open source repo where anybody can upload a CSV file or whatever format is most convenient for them. That helps us make sense of all these different funding sources that are happening off chain. Because as you said, a lot of there might be like a public grant program, but the actual payments are made off chain or they're made in a privacy preserving way. And so it can be very difficult to actually trace how much funding has gone towards what and who's funding it. And as you said, that can be very useful information for making sense of what needs more funding, what is underfunded, et cetera.
Glad I could plug you there.
Yep. Well, as we're headed towards the end of the episode, I'm wondering if we can end with a very open-ended question, and that's: is there anything I didn't ask that you want to say? James, maybe I'll go to you first, and then Carl, and if Jonas returns, we'll go to him after that.
There's a lot of things that I'm really encouraged by in this space. I think we're, just one of the repercussions of the market the way it is unfortunately what we're dealing with in the public goods funding ecosystem. But nevertheless, the experimentation that we're all pushing forward, I'm really encouraged by. Some of the things that you'll see with us exploring either later this year or early into next year, as well as like how, from a community standpoint, can we start to reward good decision making. And so community members that are participating in grant rounds, rather than just going straight towards, donating to whoever was best at DMing and messages, actually community members taking the time to try to make high quality decisions based upon outcomes that the grant round is intended for. And then those members may be making or receiving some kind of incentive on the back end of that after impact has been evaluated. So things like that, I think we can definitely shift more towards, so that we're moving away from the vibes based stuff that I know Carl and others have written about. So I'm really excited to explore that and other novel ideas.
James, same question to you, Carl. Anything I didn't ask that you want to say?
I would just, I guess, like to appreciate the three of you for all having funds in various capacities that have been able to kind of continuously keep deploying funding and iterate. I think the easy thing would have been to just stop when conditions got tough or when the narrative shifted. And I think it is by literally going through these harder patches that you're actually able to reach some state of enlightenment. I think all three of you have been really good role models in that. So just want to appreciate you.
Yeah, same to you, Carl. Not dead yet. All right, Jonas, you're up.
I think the optimistic take of where we're currently at. Lots of things are consolidating. I think a lot of us are feeling the pain of current market conditions, and especially in Ethereum public good space, funding drying up. But I think it's actually, we're making a lot of progress, and we're seeing much more signal and noise getting reduced. And it's a great time to actually um, jump in and continue pushing things forward. I think actually, when I look around and I look at the experiments that are going on, and the mechanisms that are being used, I feel better than ever about where this space is going. And I'm sure we have a great opportunity um, when things shift to really showcase that capability. So yeah, don't get too discouraged. Stay optimistic.
An on brand take. What I loved about what you said there, Jonas, is that it's true. The fundamentals of the public goods funding space in Ethereum have never been better, but the sentiment, it feels like, is pretty low. And so just the duality of those things, it tickles my brain a little bit. But yeah, stay optimistic. I love that take. Well, before we wrap, because we're getting to the bottom of the hour, does anyone have any hot takes that they want to throw into the arena before we end?
I'm gonna double down on my hot take. I don't believe in voluntary or norms-based uh, funding, and especially on competing areas. So let's say we have a ton of L2s, they're all competing with each other, and we expect each of them to contribute a certain percentage without seeing any direct benefits to their business. We will just see a classical, classical personal dilemma type stuff play out, where people want to be competitive. They will try to minimize costs, try to spend in areas that maximize their ability to win. And so I'm like very bearish on us going into the future and trying to rely on kind of this sentiment of norms based or smart default based funding. I think I'm a taxation maximalist. Right, we need taxes. We need to force people to fund public goods. There's no way around it. I know the Americans usually hate that take, but the Europeans, I think, are aligned with me. So taxation for Ethereum public goods is my pitch for 2025 and beyond.
That's definitely an iconoclastic take in the crypto space. All right, who can one up that? We're getting hot, but
I'm
we're not
gonna
sizzling yet.
I have a hot take for Jonas's take. I think we have there's already precedent in Web 2 that we can kind of force some norms. Like if you look at the Linux Foundation, you have Silicon Valley all contributing finances to funding the dependencies that, their tech stacks rely upon. And so I think we can point to examples where this is already happening, and it's happening at the business level. That we can start to encourage us to looking at other models that are already working elsewhere. So I mean, this is what we're going to try to do. But I think Jones is pretty bearish on this idea.
The arena, the actually doing it is the ultimate test. So we'll have to do another one of these episodes in a year or two and see which take was right.
So
Carl, you got
if
to
taxes do work, I'll say this: if the taxes do work, I'm really, yeah, I would love to see this actually play out because I agree with them as well.
Yeah, same. I would love to be proven wrong, so don't take this the wrong way. I'm very supportive of the norms, and Optimism is happy to pioneer a lot of them. And so, yeah, we should re-meet on this hot take and see how things play out.
David Hoffman from Bankless always says we're speedrunning the history of governance and finance. And there's something that tickles my brain about a bunch of libertarians speedrunning the history of governance and finance and then just inventing taxes all over again. It tickles my brain. Carl, do you have a hot take? Do you want to add anything here?
I guess I just want to riff on what Jonas said right now. I don't know if it's a counterpoint, but I think that
Just make it
norms can
sizzle.
emerge.
That's
Yeah,
the only thing.
norms can emerge for various reasons, right? And some are that it just makes better business sense. I think right now, if you want to have the best developer tooling in the ecosystem, you should be taking a page from what Optimism is doing right now. They're putting so much funding towards open source developers right now that anyone who has the skills to contribute should be making Optimism their first, point of departure. And if others want to compete, then and they want to get those types of people, then they have to, uh, you know, for business reasons, they have to do something there. So I think it's much more than just norms. It's actually, uh, you know, being intelligent.
Incentive alignment.
Yeah,
It's principal
that's the word.
agent game theory stuff. I'm going to take off the host hat for a sec and take my own prompt and give a hot take. For me, what's resonating for me and has heat for me is I think never be afraid to reinvent yourself. We just reset Gitcoin back to zero almost, and I think that was a huge admission of defeat in some ways. But if you look at it if you read the governance forum, I think people are so excited about Gitcoin 3.0, and I'm excited about admitting that what we were doing wasn't working and it wasn't going to get to sustainability and hitting the big reset button and then revisiting all of our priors that we had from all of the decisions that had been happening of the downstream effects of 2021 and revisiting, hey, what does a developer experience look like for capital allocation in 2025 when everyone's vibe coding? Now, what does it look like with ZK, with AI? And I think not being afraid to reinvent yourself is my hot take for this episode. I think if you're doing something that's not working, this is the liminal space between the last cycle and the new cycle, and this is the time to put down what you were working on before that wasn't working and do something completely new. And I'm doing that with Allo.Capital and Gitcoin right now. And of course, I'm not the only one. The ecosystem is shifting, and in some sense, it's like turning a battleship when an ecosystem is as big as Gitcoin. But I think that it's absolutely necessary, and I'm excited about how well positioned we're going to be for the next cycle because we're reinventing ourselves. So, hot take: sometimes you got to pivot, sometimes you got to change what's not working.
Respect.
I guess my closing question is: do y'all still believe in the vision here? Are public goods good? Is Ethereum a game-changing technology? Can we build better coordination structures? Do we still have that ember of belief? All right, now you're making me nervous
Yes,
because it's
come
been 2
on.
seconds. Oh, thank Carl, thank God. Thought we were gonna end
James,
the
what was
episode
that
on a low
look?
note.
I mean, I resonate with you all on the sentiment of the broader Ethereum ecosystem, but I mean, I think key decision makers and powerful forces all recognize the value of it. And, the other big one that I'm thinking about right now is the EF, them bringing sustainability to their treasury management and also, the drastic amount of actions that they've changed to try to right the ship. Yeah, I think I think there's enough force behind what we have in Ethereum here to really be bullish on the future of public goods funding.
Well, I think that concludes our episode for today. There's tectonic shifts happening in the public goods ecosystem. I think Octant, Optimism, Open Source Observer, I hope Gitcoin 3.0 are all part of that. So thank you all very much for your time, and see you on the Ethernets.
Thanks, Kevin.
Thank you.
Already, we just heard from Carl Cervone of Open Source Observer, Jonas from Optimism, and James Kiernan from Octant. I'm excited about the talent that we had on this episode and the changes in the Ethereum ecosystem. Thanks for listening to the Allo.Capital podcast. This podcast features the people who are building the capital allocation layer of the next internet. Disclaimer, this podcast is for informative purposes only, is not financial advice. Do your own research. Do not make any financial decisions based off of these posts, these episodes. And I also own crypto assets like ETH, USDC, and GTC. Oh, and this is the first time I can say this. I was a very, very small angel investor in Open Source Observer this round. So disclosure, I guess in some way I will have upside in Open Source Observer one day. But we are here to talk about the tectonic shifts in the Ethereum ecosystem. And I am very excited about these guests and their ecosystems and the broader shifts that are going on. I think it's going to lead to a more effective realization of the dream of Ethereum being public goods funding infrastructure for itself and then eventually the world. So thanks for listening to this episode. Grateful for your time and attention, and see you on the next one. Peace.